Thank you, Dr. Jack. It's always a pleasure to come to this All Nations Church. Thank you. This is really a very special church, and we appreciate the close spirit that we find here. And I want to second what Dr. Jack said about Dawn's music. Thank you, Dawn. That was very inspiring, very wonderful. There are so many wonderful, exciting prophecies in the Bible that are apropos for us today. We're going to be exploring one of those prophecies here this morning, the millennial week of time. It may be in your bulletin, the great week of time. There's different names for it. We're going to see why Jesus is going to be coming soon. In the beginning, incidentally, these are my notes that are on the screen that I will be following and commenting on. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Genesis 1:1. It must have been an exciting time for God when the final phase of creation came. And God said, "Let us make man in our image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them." Genesis 1:26-28. Then something very special occurred. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all his work of creating that he had done. Genesis 2, the NIV. Here's a fascinating point. To a tangible creation, God added the intangible concept of time. Then a spiritual Sabbath, which completed the weekly cycle. That week was based upon a divinely decreed period of 7 days that God had established. The months and the years were later periods of time based on the celestial movements of the earth and the moon. The record notes that there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. The 14th verse of that first chapter. But the week was God's special timepiece of 7 days, related only to the number 7. The creation week has a beginning and an ending. God later expanded the use of that number 7 to represent a template for many other clocks. He announced the measurement tied to 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years, even 70 times 7. They were all defined periods or special appointment times with God as the designer. The creation week is therefore a pattern for all time-related sevens. Each period has a defined beginning and an ending, with the seventh always being important and or even sacred. God ordained 7 days for the sanctification of the altar. As some examples here, 7 days for the sanctification of the priest. The sanctifying blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled 7 times. He ordained every 7th year as a sabbatical year when the land was to lie fallow, Leviticus 25. Every 7th sabbatical year was a sacred Jubilee year. The 7 feasts of the Lord were to be celebrated over 7 sacred months, a sacred year. beginning with the month of Abib, which begins in Exodus 12. On the 7th is restoration and deliverance. A return back, if you please, to the original. Revelation 20 describes a millennium of restoration and deliverance. Satan is bound, planet Earth is restored to peace, though it's desolate at that time. Saints reign with Christ, delivered from planet Earth. Whenever there is a timing prophecy portraying restoration or deliverance, one must conclude that there is a preceding 6. For Revelation 20, 6 millenniums. In its full expression, the Holy Spirit, and this is fascinating study in the book of Revelation, the Holy Spirit's full expression, like the latter rain, is 7. In the book of Revelation, chapter 1, 4 through 6, the heavenly Trinity, where the Godhead is giving greetings to all the people. Referring to the Holy Spirit, it says, and from the, how many spirits? 7. From the 7 spirits which are before the throne. Interesting, isn't it? These things said he that had the 7 spirits of God. Intriguingly, in Revelation, the number 7 is mentioned 54 times. In chapter 20, a millennium is mentioned 3 times. Again, might that be the 7th millennium from creation? Another way God pictures the finality of this 7 is through typological or symbolic narratives. In fact, much of prophecy is tied to such special illustrations. We could really spend an hour on this one point alone. In this context, there is something important to observe. Our relationship with God, how close we have come to the foot of the cross of Jesus Christ, determines how clearly we discern such narratives and illustrations. But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them because, interesting, isn't it? Some of these things in the Bible we are to understand are only spiritually discerned. That means we can only understand them if our orientation is with heaven. How close we are to Christ relates to how deep we can penetrate truth. Here's one such illustration. But I tell you of a truth, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the kingdom of God. Luke 9:27. Most will quickly assume this refers to the transfiguration, and that is true. But there's much more to this particular story of the transfiguration. What did Jesus mean? Some there would see the actual onset of the kingdom of God. First, the prophecy. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John, his brother, and bringeth them up into a high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them. And his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was as white as light. What does it mean after 6 days? At the 7th, he came. This is a prophecy regarding not only his kingdom, but of the millennial end. At the 7th, he comes. And there are many illustrations like this, intriguingly, in the Bible. We will see that the plan of redemption occurs after a divine period of 6 millenniums that end in a 7th, which completes a week of time a great week of time, or a millennial week of time. The millennial week of time, let's explore into this more deeply. Many Bible expositors believe, along with this ministry, the ministry we have, Prophecy Research Initiative, that Jesus will come 6,000 years, not from creation, but from Adam and Eve's fall. At the onset of the 7,000th year, man is taken to the mansions that Jesus said he was going to be preparing. Here's a little graph. Man's fall, 6 millenniums, the coming of Christ, and the 7th millennium, where we will spend in heaven. Collectively, this period is also again called the Great Week of Time. We will show you that this is where we are in this 7,000-year time period before we finish here this morning. The first specific time prophecy came in Genesis. His days will be 120 years. Genesis 6:3. A time prophecy with a defined end. Abraham was called out of the Ur of Chaldees. In faith he left, maybe with even 1,000 people. We're not 100% sure, but many scholars make that assumption. He then went through Canaan to Egypt and then back to Canaan. Then the second time prophecy came in the Bible. In covenant promise, God said, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs," speaking of Egypt, "where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Oh my, that must have given Abraham a lot of concern. Genesis 15:13. A time prophecy with a defined end. But Abraham in faith had to look forward long into the future for that end prophecy. Now looking at the final time prophecy, it is that millennial period that has a very defined redemptive end. They shall reign with Christ. How long? 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed, and the devil was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are. And death and hell were cast also into that lake of fire. What happens after that millennial end? Before I read this verse, maybe I should just make a passing comment. When studying the prophecies in the Bible, 7 is a very sacred number, as we are addressing here this morning. But if you study 8, the number 8, which follows 7, almost always the number of 8, which is mentioned many times in the Bible, means a beginning again. Very fascinating. Revelation 20 talks about the millennium. If it is the 7th millennium that it's referring to, is it possible that the next chapter will talk about a beginning again? Here it is. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. That's a new beginning again, following exactly the pattern we find throughout the whole Bible. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, which along with this time to become part of that final new heaven and new earth. And there was no longer any sea. Revelation 21, verse 1. A looming question. Can one show there is a 6,000-year period that precedes Revelation 20 millennium? It is studying and faith affirming to see what information God has given to us. Another question. How close can we get to the onset of the 6,000-year period? Surprisingly, as you will see, very close. We're going to find that there are clues that warn us that the end of the 6th millennium is pending. Then the second coming occurs. Let's see what we can discover. Daniel received a millennial vision, 3,426 approximate years from creation. We'll review some of those figures in just a few minutes. The following prophecy is recorded in Daniel 8:14, a very familiar verse to Seventh-day Adventists. Those 2,300 atonement years would begin from a decree of restoration, Daniel 9:25, and specifically recorded in Ezra 7. That would not occur for another 100 years after Daniel received that prophecy. 3,426 years plus 100 would be 3,526 years from creation this decree would occur. That decree was 458 to 457 BC. I'm giving you a year period only because that was the 7th year of Artaxerxes I. 2,477 years ago. 2,477 years plus the 3526 equals 6,003 years from the age of the earth since creation. Are you following? Really, it's very simple what God is providing for us to see. How long they were in the Garden of Eden, we aren't sure. Remember, the 6,000 years really begins from the fall of Adam and Eve. So we don't really know how long they were there. But most scholars feel that it was probably a very short period of time because Cain was not born until after they left the garden. God repeatedly uses this timing module in redemptive prophecy. Creation week, 7th day holy, recalling God's creative power and being in his presence as we are here this morning. Redemptive time, 7th millennium holy, observing God's recreative power and being physically in his presence at that time. Warning, because so few of God's people expected the arrival of Jesus at his first advent, Expositor White made this profound observation. Incidentally, I often say Expositor White in my writings and from the pulpit because we often are speaking to non-Adventist groups. How that's the story of the leaders in Christ's day, warns us to beware, lest by, and oh my, this is tough language coming from Ellen White, lest by our criminal indifference, did you know she had something that tough in her writings? Lest by our criminal indifference we also fail to discern what? The signs of the times. That means we really need to understand prophecy carefully and thoroughly. And therefore know not the day of our visitation. Never the day or the hour, but we need to know that his coming is even at the doors. It is unto them that look for him that Christ is to appear the second time without sin unto salvation. Oh my, this is a great challenge from Ellen White. Really, really understand the things that are in the Holy Word of God. Let's now note how history identifies with this millennial week of time. As another overview, Adam and Eve's leaving the garden, 6 millenniums, Christ comes. 1 millennium, and then we find the new heavens and the new earth. That is the millennial week of time. What did ancient religious scholars think about this? Is this something brand new? Is this something only oriented to maybe even Adventists? Well, let's look at some of this. Let's look at Jewish history briefly. This is a quote. The verse, 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday, Psalms 90, verse 4, having suggested the idea that the present world of toil is to be followed by a what? Sabbatical millennium, the world to come. That's the Jewish encyclopedia. Epistle of Barnabas in AD of 150 approximately. Consider, my children, what signify the words. He finished them in 6 days. They mean this, that in 6,000 years the Lord will make an end of all things. This has been known for over 2,000 years, this concept. Irenaeus, one of the early Christian church fathers, in as many days as this world was made, in so many thousands of years, shall it be concluded. This is an account of the things formerly created, as also it is a prophecy, amazing, of what is to come. They will come to an end at the 6,000th year. We now question, is written history of this world detailed enough to suggest or even conclude the 6,000-year age as suggested by these men? Besides Daniel, is the biblical record thorough enough to reveal a similar period? Finally, are there scientific clues that might validate the biblical age of the earth? God's great week of time urges us to find every clue possible to affirm this biblical precept. It is actually possible that we might just be right at the end of time. Let us now explore what is known about the ages of the past from the Bible. It will be important evidence for Advent believers that a terminus ad quem, the roundup, the final point of time, is about to occur. 7 millenniums. The 6th millennium we are in, we assume, and we divide that millennium into 10 centuries, and the question mark, are we right at the end of that 10th century? Many genealogies in the Bible are important because they contain timing markers. The period between Adam and the flood, as an example, though the ancient Greek Septuagint has a vastly different age list than the Hebrew Masoretic text, and we think we know why, we rely on the latter, as do most English translations. Those records note that Noah was 600 years old when the flood came, Genesis 7. This may seem too old for that colossal boat riding, but God is precise. This is an important age of reference for our study. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Did you catch that? Did you note all the numbers? Not only is Noah's age given, but the month, which is in the Hebrew Iyar, and the specific day when the flood began. This would coincide, the flood came in our April and May period. For an event that occurred over 4,000 years ago, we sure have to study calendar details from the Bible. I'm not going to go over this list, but from Genesis 1, 5, and 7, we can derive quite accurately that the flood came and Noah was 600 years old, 1,656 years after creation. Creation occurred that period of time before the flood. We still don't know how long Adam and Eve were in the garden before the fall, which begins the 6,000-year clock. But again, it was likely very, very short. Let's now analyze more details. Cautiously, we won't get too deep. 2 years after the flood, Shem had Arphaxad, 1658 years from creation. Abraham was born to Terah 350 years later, when he was 130, 2008 years after creation. From verses 10 through 32, time genealogies cover 9 generations. From Shem, Noah's son, to the death of Terah, Abraham's father, the earth was 83 years old when Terah died. That was the year Abraham's first received the covenant promise in Genesis 12. Abraham was 75 years old when he received those promises, that number of years from creation. Galatians 3:16 through 17, and Exodus 12 reveals that the law was given at Sinai 430 years after Abraham received the promises. So we add that to that 2083, we get 2513 after creation. Moses received the 10 Commandments from God. 1 Kings 6:1 brings us up to the 4th year of Solomon's reign, when the temple building had been started. This verse notes that this year was 480 years from Exodus, the apparent year the law was given at Sinai. 2513 plus 480, 2993 from creation was Solomon's 4th year. This was Solomon's 4th regnal, or reigning year, when the temple work was begun. Year 2989, subtracting 4, would be the beginning of that first year. Can we discover historically when Solomon began his reign? Ancient records do help us come closer. Most ancient historians suggest between 1007 and 970 BC. This is an absolute scholarly range from many, many different scholars. 971 BC is a year accepted by many archaeologists from the work of the late Edwin R. Thiele. He was professor at that time at the Bible department at Emmanuel Missionary College, where I went to school. And he was very wonderful to talk to about some of these chronologies. 986 BC has been more recently presented in the work of astronomer Pratt. We use 986 for illustration purposes. This is what we discovered. 0 years in the bottom part of the line, moving straight to 2989, which was the first year of Solomon's reign. 986 BC, going towards the top, that would put the flood around 2345 BC. This can then give us a wonderful clue as to the age of the earth. 2989 years after creation that Solomon began his first reign, plus the 986 BC is 3975, and then we add other figures down below. Year 1 from BC to AD, 2018, our year. And from the Bible, we can show that we are 5,994 years since creation, and the only variable is the year of Solomon's reign. We're not attempting to develop an exact date when Christ will come. We never do that. Our objective is to see if that 6,000 years might be coming close. And I hope even by this point you're beginning to see that as a possibility. Interesting. Daniel's analysis suggests we are 6,003 years from creation. This study of the genealogies, 5,994 from creation. Might we be getting close to the 6,000 years from the fall when Jesus will come again? Many Bible expositors have reviewed the significance of the 6,000-year-old earth. This is a unique area of study for creationists in their drive to show the theory of evolution to be incorrect. Ellen White put many of these issues into a very healthy perspective. Her statements weren't simply a carte blanche that planet Earth was 6,000 years old. We've studied these very carefully. They were actually placed by her in a very scholarly and interesting framework of understanding. Notice the expressions of her statements. About 6,000 years, more than 6,000 years, for nearly 6,000 years, for 6,000 years. At first glance, it appears that there's a lack of precision. Is it about, more, nearly, or exactly 6,000 years? As with all writings, the author is due a careful study of how a statement is made in context. That includes the Bible. Let's sequentially look at these various timing expressions and see how they are actually very consistent. Examples of 6,000 years. Never has the world's need for teaching and healing been greater than it is today. The world is full of those who need to be ministers unto the weak, the helpless, etc. The continual transgression of man for nearly 6,000 years has brought sickness, pain, and death as its fruit. Next quote. The great controversy between Christ and Satan that has been carried forward for nearly 6,000 years is soon to close. So now she's looking forward to the closing of it with Christ's coming. So she's accurate. If the limits of sin are bound with a 6th millennium period, then creation would have occurred just before then. Did Expositor White note this? To this earth, angel have come with the message of redemption. In its hills and valleys have echoed their song of rejoicing. Its soil has been trodden by the feet of the Son of God. And for more than, here it is, she's being very accurate, more than 6,000 years in its form of beauty and gifts for sustenance, the earth has borne witness of the Creator's love. What about Satan's long rebellious history? More than 6,000 years of continual practice has increased his skill to deceive and to allure. Do you see how carefully Expositor White is in her work? She's very precise in talking about this period of time. She's very consistent and leaves nothing to our tongue. Satan's last chance. In this graph here, we had rebellion before the creation of the world. Then, for an unknown period of time, then the creation comes. Adam and Eve's fall. This is Satan's last chance on the laboratory called planet Earth, and it will stop shortly before Jesus comes. Man's fall creation, where we are at the present time. Will God bring a halt to Satan's work at the end of 6,000 years of sin? The great controversy between Christ and Satan that has been carried forward for nearly 6,000 years is soon to close, and the wicked one redoubles his efforts to defeat the work of Christ in man's behalf and to fasten souls in his snare. We are living at that time. Satan is panicking that his time is running out. Satan knows prophecy very well. Now let's step into another round to continue building our information. What does the physical world show? Does it come close to the approximate biblical time? There is much evidence to corroborate with the Old Testament. The biblical data for the flood of 2345 BC is within 100 plus or minus years, using several methods of calculation from Earth's evidence. Let's look at some of that evidence from the natural world. Evidence from planet Earth. The Earth's rotational speed is gradually slowing down. Currently it is at 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. If the Earth were millions of years old, its speed would have been so great that it would be likely a pancake. Nothing would be retained on its surface. For Earth's changing speed alone, a young Earth is known and suggested. Another fascinating issue comes from the magnetic fields of the Earth. They are decreasing. If we would look backwards from the present trend to just 20,000 years ago, it would have been a liquefied mass and no life could have existed. There's more to this magnetic field issue Intriguingly, the sun changes its electrical field every 11 years. It changed in 2012, the next will be into 2023, if Jesus hasn't come by then. Intriguingly, the Earth has magnetic movements also. There is something very fascinating regarding the magnetic movements of planet Earth. Based upon McFarland's alternative magnetic field theory, the evidence suggests that something dramatic occurred 4,500 years ago to this Earth. That would be around the time of the flood. God's clocks are right on time. Bristlecone pine. Methuselah tree is one of them. 4,789 rings. Prometheus, 4,844 rings that come boreholes into these trees to count the rings. Calculated from the flood plus Methuselah's age, the Earth would be 6,499. Prometheus, 6,547. It's interesting that some years trees will have more than one ring. Are we dealing at least with a 6 millennial period of time? Since there are many factors that might influence the number of rings within a tree, the figures given are the maximum rings that the tree could have. Brothers and sisters, time is short. Evidence from human history. The early work of archaeologists gleaning information from Egyptian, Babylonian, and Sumerian tablets initially set those civilizations at 3000 BC. More recent studies reveal that was actually too old. They are now placing the oldest Sumerian tablets at around 2385. They can't be exact. This would reflect a people with writing skills immediately after the flood. 2385 to 1656 years before the flood, and one gets 6041 years from creation. A biblically young earth, time is short. Oil and gas reserve gives us a clock. These fossil fuels are located in porous or permeable rock. They are constantly leaking in many areas under the ocean floor. If the age of the earth was even 20,000 years old, these reserves would have been depleted long ago. Shifting of the earth plates has been studied as initiating these leaks. They appear to have been moved in a major way around 2400 BC. Hello? That's the time of the flood. Niagara Falls has an interesting clock. 20% of the world's fresh water flows over these falls. The friction of the water of the rocks erodes the cliffs, believe it or not, approximately 3 feet a year. This has been studied geologically as to how long the river channel would take to erode its original terminus at Lake Ontario. It is 2018, 4387 years ago, the time of the flood, a biblically young earth. Mississippi Delta shows that we have a biblically young earth of 5956 because of the sediment that comes out from the Mississippi River. They can determine back when that sediment began, right near the flood. The thickness of the ocean sediments. They range in great different thicknesses, but they have averaged them out. And the sediments of the ocean suggest an earth of about 6,000 years, adding to the time of the flood and backwards to those genealogies. Coral growth patterns also suggest the time of the flood when they began. What have we learned about God's great week of time, the millennial week of time from the Bible? 6,003 years, Daniel. 5,994 years from the patriarchs. The average 5,996. Are we getting close to the 6,000 year point? We are. The natural world, the average of all the things that we went over, 5,935 years. If we look at the biblical record of this 6,000 years and assume that Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden for only a few years before the fall, they had no children until afterwards, we assume, we could conclude that very soon now, the millennial week of time is going to end, and we are going to see the face of Jesus Christ. But there is a day that God hath appointed for the close of the world's history. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then the end will come. That's Matthew 24:14. Prophecy is fast fulfilling. More, much more should be said about these tremendous, important subjects. The day is at hand when the destiny of every soul will be fixed forever. This day of the Lord hastens on apace. The false watchmen are raising the cry, all is well. But the day of God is rapidly approaching. Its footsteps are so muffled that it does not arouse the world from the death-like slumber into which it has fallen. The solemn fact is to be kept not only before the people of the world, but before our own churches, like we're doing here this morning. That day of the Lord will come suddenly and unexpectedly. The fearful warning of the prophecy is addressed to every soul. Let no one feel that he is secure from the danger of being surprised. Let no one's interpretation of prophecy rob you of the conviction of the knowledge of events which show that this great event is right at hand, very near. Folks, we are this close. We're right there. There are so many prophecies that are being fulfilled right before us, and we just really need to visit these prophecies more. Jesus said, Revelation 3:22, Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Many scholars have criticized that verse. Many scholars have said Jesus said that 2,000 years ago and he's not here. But there are some scholars that have devoted their whole life to the book of Revelation. And they interpret that in a very different, healthy way. In light of the prophecies in the book of Revelation, as they are being fulfilled, Jesus is coming quickly. That's a point of reference. That means we need to understand the book of Revelation far, far more. Behold, I come quickly. Blessed is he that keepeth the sayings of the prophecy of this book. Let's bow our heads. Our Heavenly Father, you're so wonderful to give us clues, signs of the times in which we are living in, beautiful thoughts from the Scriptures to tell us that we shouldn't put off our preparation for eternity. I pray, Lord, that as we leave this place, we will have a renewed interest to understand these truths, these prophecies, so that each one of us realize that the clock really is running out and our probation will soon close. We pray these things now in the name of Jesus, the holy name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen. Amen.